They never feared your anger. Understand that first before anything else lands. They never lost sleep over your frustration. They never convened emergency meetings because you were upset. Upset people are manageable. Upset people are actually quite useful. They make noise in the wrong direction. They exhaust themselves against surfaces designed to absorb exactly that kind of impact. And then they get tired and go home and sit down. What they feared, what genuinely, deeply, structurally unsettled the people who built comfortable systems on the assumption that most people would simply never question them, was not your anger, it was your awareness. Because awareness that is turned into action, awareness that is moved from simply seeing clearly to actually living differently, thinking differently, refusing differently. That is the one variable their entire model was not built to accommodate. They planned for compliance. They invested enormously in compliance, in the invisible architecture of it, the cultural machinery of it, the educational systems, media structures, and social reward mechanisms, all quietly engineered to produce people who are just comfortable enough to stay still and just distracted enough to never ask why. And then there is you, not fitting, not settling, not staying still. Not because you decided one morning to be difficult, but because something in you, something at the level of how you are actually constructed, kept refusing to accept the version of reality they were distributing. That refusal, let's talk about that refusal because it is more significant than you may have been told. Every society at every point in history has had a population distribution, the majority who absorb the prevailing narrative without significant friction, the minority who feel something is slightly off but cannot locate the source of the discomfort precisely enough to act on it. And then, the smallest group, the one that makes power structures nervous in a way they work very hard not to show. The people who see the architecture, not just the surface, not just the policies or the headlines or the obvious presentations of how things work. The actual architecture, the underlying logic, the way systems are designed, not by accident, but by intention. Intention that serves specific interests while presenting itself as neutral, natural, inevitable, simply the way things are. You see the architecture. And the moment a person genuinely sees it, not as a conspiracy, not with paranoia, not through the distorted lens of bitterness, but clearly, accurately, with the kind of grounded perception that can distinguish between what is real and what has simply been repeated often enough to feel real. The moment that happens, something shifts permanently. You cannot unsee structure once you have seen it. And that permanence, that irreversibility, is what makes people like you so uncomfortable for people whose comfort depends on the structure remaining invisible. Let's be precise about what rebelliousness actually means here, because the word gets cheapened. It applies to aesthetics, to how someone dresses, what music they listen to, and which surface level conventions they choose to ignore. And that kind of rebelliousness is completely fine with the people at the top. Completely fine. In fact, it is actively encouraged in certain forms because it gives the appearance of freedom while changing absolutely nothing about how power actually moves. Buy the rebellious product, adopt the rebellious aesthetic, consume the rebellious content, feel like an individual, go back to sleep. That is not what you are doing. What you are doing is more fundamental and more threatening than any aesthetic choice could ever be. You are questioning the premises, not the conclusions, the premises. The foundational assumptions that most people absorb so early and so completely that they stop being visible as assumptions at all and simply become the texture of reality itself. Why is this normal? Who decided this was inevitable? What interests does this arrangement actually serve? Who benefits from me believing that my current ceiling is the natural limit of what is possible for someone like me? Those questions, asked genuinely, pursued seriously, followed wherever they actually lead rather than abandoned at the first uncomfortable destination. Those questions are the rebelliousness that livid people in high places. Not because the questions are dangerous in some dramatic sense, because questions that get answered produce people who live differently. And people who live differently, who make different choices, build different structures, refuse different things, create different models, those people are evidence. Living, visible, undeniable evidence that the available options were always wider than the distributed map suggested. And evidence is the one thing a system built on manufactured consensus cannot afford too much of. Now let's talk about sleep, because that word, the idea of keeping you asleep, keeping society asleep, that deserves more than a metaphor. Sleep in this context is not laziness. Do not let anyone reduce it to that. The people who remained asleep are not stupid. They are not weak. They are not inferior in any meaningful human sense. They are the product of an extraordinarily sophisticated, extraordinarily well-resourced, extraordinarily long-running effort to make waking up feel unnecessary. Think about the engineering of that. If you want people to remain unquestioning, you do not simply withhold information that creates curiosity. You provide an overwhelming abundance of the wrong information, packaged attractively, delivered constantly, calibrated precisely to occupy the exact mental bandwidth that might otherwise be used for the kind of deep, sustained, independent thinking that leads to genuine awakening. You keep people entertained but not fulfilled, informed but not educated, connected but not communal, busy but not purposeful. You give them just enough comfort, just enough distraction, just enough of a sense that they are participating in something meaningful to make the gap between where they are and where they could be feel too abstract to pursue. And it works. On most people, in most circumstances, it works remarkably well, but not on everyone. Some people, and this is not about superiority. This is about a specific combination of temperament and experience, and perhaps something even more fundamental than either of those. Some people have a built-in resistance to the sedative. They absorb the entertainment, but don't feel satisfied. They receive the information, but sense the gaps. They participate in the available structures, but feel the edges of them pressing against something in them that refuses to be fully contained. That resistance, that specific, innate, unchosen resistance, is what I mean when I say DNA. Because some of this is actually that deep, not in a mystical sense, in a very practical, observable sense. The capacity for independent thought, the tolerance for being outside consensus, the ability to hold an uncomfortable truth steadily in your mind without immediately reaching for the nearest available comfort that would make it go away. The specific kind of courage that is not dramatic, not the courage of grand gestures, but the quiet, daily, socially costly courage of simply continuing to see what you see, even when everyone around you is invested in you seeing something else. These are not skills that are equally distributed. They are not equally cultivated, and they are not equally rewarded. In fact, they are frequently punished, subtly and not so subtly, because any social system will naturally apply pressure against the people who threaten its cohesion by refusing to share its foundational assumptions. You have felt that pressure, not always from enemies, sometimes from the people closest to you. The confusion on their faces when you refuse to follow the expected path. The concern that was genuine, but was also, underneath the genuineness, a request. Please come back inside the lines. Please stop making this choice that makes us question our own choices. Please be less of what you are, because what you are is making the gap between us visible in a way that is uncomfortable for everyone. That pressure is real, and it is heavy. And carrying it without either collapsing under it or becoming bitter because of it, that requires something that most motivational language completely fails to honor in its full difficulty. It requires you to keep believing in what you see when the social reward for pretending not to see it would be immediate and significant. The elites, and let's use that word not as a vague conspiracy, but as a precise description of the people whose power depends on the current arrangement remaining unquestioned. Their lividity at your rebelliousness is actually information. Because powerful people do not get genuinely disturbed by things that don't matter. They do not deploy resources, social pressure, narrative management, institutional friction against things that pose no real challenge to anything they care about. That would be inefficient. And whatever else you might say about the people who have successfully accumulated and maintained significant power, they are not inefficient about protecting it. So when the response to what you are doing, the thinking, the questioning, the refusing, the building of something outside the approved structures, when the response to that is disproportionate, when it feels like more resistance than the visible surface of your actions should logically produce, it means the questions you are asking, the example you are living, the alternative you are constructing with your choices and your consciousness and your refusal to simply accept the distributed version of what is possible, it means that is landing somewhere that matters. That it is creating the one thing power structures genuinely cannot absorb cleanly. A living demonstration that the walls are not where they said the walls were. That the ceiling they described as natural is actually a construction. That the limits they presented as inevitable are actually maintained, actively, deliberately maintained, and can therefore be actively, deliberately exceeded. So let's talk about what you are actually building here. Because rebelliousness without construction is just protest. And protest without vision eventually exhausts itself against the thing it opposes and produces nothing durable. What makes your rebelliousness significant? What elevates it from reaction into something genuinely threatening to the people who need you unconscious is that it is generative, building a different way of thinking about what you are capable of, building a different relationship to the information you receive and the narratives you are offered and the identities that are handed to you by systems that benefit from you accepting them without examination. Building, slowly, imperfectly, through trial and genuine error, an existence that operates from your own genuine perception, rather than from the approved map. And that building, that slow, unglamorous, frequently lonely, socially costly, internally demanding act of constructing something real from your own understanding, that is what they cannot replicate or redirect or absorb or neutralize. They can manage protest. They have entire departments for that. They can handle the person who is angry at the system from inside the system's own terms. They have processes for that, frameworks, pressure valves specifically engineered to let that energy release without actually changing anything structural. What they cannot handle, what genuinely disrupts the model, is the person who has exited the system's own terms entirely, who is no longer arguing on the system's ground, using the system's language according to the system's rules of engagement, who has simply walked outside that entire frame and started building from different materials entirely. Because there is a version of this conversation that stays entirely sociological, systems and power and structures and resistance, and that version is true and useful and important. But it is not the whole truth. The whole truth includes something more personal, more interior, more specifically about the particular wiring of the person who cannot be put to sleep regardless of how sophisticated the sedative becomes. Not because it was destined in any fatalistic sense, but because the combination of how you perceive and how you process and how you respond to the gap between what you are told and what you actually observe, that combination was always going to produce friction with any system that depended on you not noticing that gap. And the world, the specific, curated, carefully managed version of the world that powerful interests need most people to accept, was always going to have a problem with someone who notices and then refuses to pretend they don't. The capacity to see clearly and remain honest about what you see, in the face of social pressure to see differently, in the face of comfort available to those who would simply agree, in the face of the very real cost of being the person in the room who keeps saying, "No, look again. This does not add up. This does not serve what it claims to serve. This arrangement benefits some people enormously at the expense of others, and the fact that it has been normalized does not make it natural that capacity is rare, and rare things, when they appear in human beings, have historically been both persecuted and ultimately impossible to fully suppress." What does a person do when they understand that their rebelliousness is not a personality quirk or a phase or evidence of some deficit in their ability to adapt, but is actually a fundamentally accurate response to a fundamentally constructed reality? That is the first thing. And it sounds simple, and it is not simple at all, because the apology has become habitual. The softening of your perception to make it more socially palatable. The hedging of your observations so that the people around you don't feel implicated. The constant internal negotiation between what you actually see and what it is safe to say you see. It is costing you the full use of the very thing that makes you significant. The clear, honest, unhedged perception that would, if expressed fully, if trusted completely, if built upon without the constant self-interruption of social management, produce something genuinely new, something that the people who needed you asleep were correct to be afraid of. Because the fully awake version of you, the one that has stopped managing its own perception to remain acceptable, that has stopped translating its own understanding into softer language for the comfort of people invested in the current arrangement, not dramatically, not overnight, not in the cinematic way that makes for clean narratives and satisfying three-act structures, in the durable way, the way that compounds over time. The way that builds something that outlasts the resistance against it, because it is constructed from something the resistance cannot dismantle. Genuine understanding, freely arrived at, honestly expressed, and lived out with consistency. Be that problem deliberately. Be it with full consciousness of what you are doing, and why it matters, and what it costs, and what it builds. Be it with the patience that long-term construction requires, because the systems you are pressing against were built over generations and will not reorganize themselves on a short timeline regardless of the quality of your perception or the accuracy of your understanding. Be it with the specific kind of humility that keeps your vision clean, the humility that says, "I may be seeing clearly and I am still learning." The humility that distinguishes between questioning the system and having all the answers. The humility that keeps rebelliousness from calcifying into its own kind of rigid dogma. without the constant performance of reassurance for the people whose comfort depends on your uncertainty, without the endless softening, without the habitual self-interruption that takes your most important perceptions and wraps them in so many qualifications that by the time they reach the air, they have lost the force that made them matter. And when the resistance comes, when the lividity of the people who needed you manageable makes itself felt in whatever form it takes, through whatever channels it uses, with whatever sophistication it deploys, evidence that the awakened version of you, the one they worked so hard and invested so much to prevent, arrived anyway through whatever combination of temperament and experience, and something even deeper than both of those, through the specific, unchosen, irreversible wiring of someone who was always going to see what they see and always going to refuse what they refuse. You woke up. And they have been livid ever since. Stay awake.